Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. So today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country, and my name is Wendy Nash. I'm in Caboolture, just north of Brisbane. I have Peter Parker. I know you, Peter, because I came across some things on LinkedIn, and it was about buses, and we have a terrible bus service here. So I'm really curious to hear about your success. Whereabouts are you calling from, and whether you have a project name? Just start there.
Thanks, Wendy. Hello to all listeners. My name is Peter Parker. I am talking to you from the lands of the Dandenong people, southeast of Melbourne. My background is as a transport planner, originally in the Department of Transport, but I'm speaking to you as an independent individual member of the community, and we've been able to achieve some good things with buses southeast of Melbourne in the City of Greater Dandenong. The campaign which we've been running is called the Fix800Bus. We've been able to get 7-day bus services running on one of the key main highway routes running through the City of Dandenong. So that's a very big win for the community, including a change. That timetable hasn't been changed for over 30 years, but we've been able to secure budget funding from that, and it's due to the work of the community and people getting together that we were able to get that win.
Congratulations. As I said, our bus services leaves a lot to be desired. They're slow, they're meandering, they exist theoretically, but as a bus professional said recently, we're just driving buses around full of air. So it sounds like you've increased the number of people who are also using those, and it sounds like you've got a lot of engagement in that. And I was curious, what made you interested in transport planning? Tell me a little bit about your backstory about how you actually even became interested in that.
Goes back a long time ago. I was 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, I was interested in transport planning before I became professionally involved in it. I lived in an area, I suppose, similar to parts of Brisbane where the bus services were very limited, and I just saw that there is potential for them to be so much better, because a lot of the times, most of the week, buses spend their time in the depot. They don't actually spend their time on active service. You've got very limited operating hours. So there are things that you could do very cheaply, even without buying more buses. You could make routes more direct, you could run them 7 days a week, you could run them more frequently, you can connect better with trains. There are just so many things that you can do with buses, very cheap, very cost effective to do. While governments spend money on these huge mega infrastructure projects, it's actually buses that give you your last mile connectivity from the train. They give you connectivity across the city rather than just into the CBD. And for where people want to go in communities, that's really important connectivity for them. It really improves opportunities for them.
I was really interested by the question, the buses actually spend a lot of time in the depot, not being driven around. So what stops them being driven around?
We need more bus drivers, and that requires effectively government funding. So although the bus company, they themselves might really want an improved service, like most forms of transport, buses do require government subsidy. The fares don't cover everything. Same with roads as well. You know, most roads are untolled. So again, it's the government's got to chip in and provide funding. And it's the same with buses and trains. And without that operating funding, you don't get much of a service.
You were talking about connectivity and the last mile. Perhaps you could speak to that.
Buses provide opportunities. They are an opportunity enabler. They basically enable people to achieve their dreams, whether it be jobs, whether it be education, whether it be social connections. Most people in Australian cities are not walking distance of a train or a tram. Therefore, buses have got to form an important element of that connectivity. So when you improve bus services, you expand opportunities, improve access to jobs, you improve access to education. There's huge social benefits in improved bus services, and I don't think that's necessarily always always realised.
When I've spoken with people, they go, "Oh, buses, we can't make a profit off them." And I think, well, you can't make a profit off the cars either. Cars are hugely expensive. People are always shocked when I tell them, when you pay your fees and registration and everything for your car, that's just a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of how much actually gets spent on the car. Just enormous. Not only road building cost and maintenance, but also the obesity cost, public health consequences, collisions, all that is enormous. And it stops anybody else from being able to have an alternative.
That's right. One of our previous ministers mentioned that you got $5 return for every $1 you spent on improved bus services. Our previous public transport minister said that. So there's a very, very strong case for building up bus services.
You've had success with a particular bus service. Tell our listener what worked. What can the community do? What role does the local government have? How did you get that happening? Because that's no small feat, and that definitely deserves a huge congratulations. I'm completely envious. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you need a very strong case. There are so many things that could be improved with buses. I could come up with a list of 500 things right off the top of my head for buses in Melbourne. But one at a time, start off maybe one thing to focus on, a very strong case that would make a big difference, and especially if it can be done relatively cheaply. For instance, we have a bus route, Route 800, which runs along a main highway in Melbourne, Princes Highway, from Dandenong, which is one of the biggest suburban centres, about 25 kilometres southeast of Melbourne, runs down Princes Highway to Chadstone Shopping Centre, one of the biggest shopping centres that's very, very busy on weekends. Despite that, it only ran every 2 hours on Saturday afternoon, so it's a bit like an out of Brisbane bus. Didn't run at all on Sundays, and it finished very early at night. Even though there were a lot of people and jobs along that bus route, they couldn't actually get to them at times that they would want to travel, especially on weekends and after 7 p.m. We focused on the Route 800 bus. It was a fantastic thing because it was a main highway bus route. We were able to put in a data request, so we got patronage figures from our Department of Transport that confirmed that the bus had much higher usage than average. It was the busiest bus route in Melbourne that didn't run 7 days. Although transport departments have a lot of priorities for things that they themselves want to do, this was clearly at the top of it. So there was a very strong objective case, yet its timetable hadn't changed for 30 years. There's a very strong case for a community campaign. There are people whose only public transport was the 800 bus. So we had a very, very strong case for it. It even went past the Premier's electoral offices, which was great for optics and campaigning. So we thought, let's focus on the Route 800. So we came up with the idea of Fix800Bus that we used for our social media, our videos, and our letterbox drops. We kept a very, very simple message. We weren't going to change the bus route. The route was pretty straight and direct as it was. It was also quite cheap to upgrade because the buses that you would need to be running on weekends exist already. They just stay in the depot on weekends. So it was just a matter of hiring more bus drivers, a little bit of extra money for fuel, and then you'd have this 7-day Route 800 bus. And so it was simple to do operationally. You weren't putting other people's noses out of joint by changing bus networks radically, although in some areas that's a good thing to do. But in this case, it was a simple, very simple upgrade to do. And it was a simple message as well. And I think a simple message is important to get people, even non-bus users, engaged, because improved buses not only benefit those people who ride the buses, but also people who drive cars, because there's issues with competition for parking at, say, major shopping centres. And if you don't have a bus, then that's not a transport alternative and it doesn't relieve traffic. And buses can really help with road congestion, even with families that already own multiple cars. We've got a cost of living crisis and a housing crisis, and better buses can really relieve those sorts of things. And where you've got families, let's say they might have teenage children that might be looking at getting retail jobs, they will require working on weekends and often at night. So having better buses means that parents don't have to go and pick up their kids from the shopping centre, so that saves them a bit of time and it relieves a bit of traffic on the road. So there's huge benefits of getting better bus services, particularly a route that we know would be very strongly used, like the 800 bus. So So that was a really strong part of the campaign. Local media, especially if you can help journalists write their stories, like media are in the point of a lot of cutbacks with the mainstream media, with social media competing with them, but we can help journalists write stories. And so we've had some good media appearances, and media often feed off one another. So if you have something in, say, a local newspaper, then you might have ABC radio or other radio stations come up, other newspapers, other media as well. So that can help spread the message. Stakeholders like local councillors, although this campaign was largely outside of council, it was really good getting local councillors on board as well, because they can share things from your social media to their social media. Sometimes councils might have, in east of Melbourne, we have the Eastern Transport Coalition, which is a group of councils in the area, and they can help advocate things. And although councils don't provide bus services directly, they do have contacts with state government, so they can help advocate. That's particularly good, especially as they tend to be closer to local residents than, say, a state government agency. So that can be beneficial. There is also, maybe not for this podcast, but there is also a political angle as well that people should acquaint themselves with. And that was a major part of our campaign.
As I said, I don't want to go too much into the politics, but perhaps you would generally took a bipartisan approach to
Correct.
political angle.
Multipartisan, like they're independent.
Okay, so you focused really on making it more a social issue rather than a political issue. Does that sound right?
Well, it's a community need. I suppose inevitably you're talking to all sorts of people engaged in a political process, whether it be local councillors, whether it be candidates in and out of Parliament. So yeah, we are talking to a lot of people and trying to impress on them the importance of better bus services. The campaign's been running for about 2 years until we got the budget funding. It hasn't started yet. It takes time for the department to organise that, but we do have budget funding, which is fantastic. Yeah, so it takes about 2 years, and in that time we had a state election and a by-election, and that helped our campaign.
That's useful to know because we've got a state election coming up. I was actually speaking with a politician and they just said, look, it's a problem for everybody. It doesn't matter which way you go. I thought that was an interesting perspective.
One thing about it is, do not assume that even a person may be from a particular party and you might think there's all these, party baggages associated with that. Don't make those assumptions.
That's great because I meet all our councillors in the state and the federal, and everybody comes from different angles, and then it changes, and here you've got 1 month and then another year you've got somebody else. So it is a matter of just getting on with everybody to look at that. If you had a bus service which was circuitous and infrequent, what would you suggest would be a way to work with that to engage the state government?
Okay, infrequent is, I suppose, easier to fix than circuitous, because important thing is also important to look at the times of the week. Like if it's frequent on weekdays but infrequent on weekends, then that gives you an opportunity because you know that the buses already exist to run it frequently on weekends. If it's infrequent both weekdays and weekends, then if it's frequent in peak times but not peak times, then again that's an opportunity because you know the buses exist. If it's infrequent all the time including peak time, then you may have to buy new buses, which would make it a bit more expensive and politically more difficult to do. The low-hanging fruit is where if the bus is frequent during the peak times but not off-peak and weekends, then you know that it's cheap to upgrade and they've really got no excuses. It just needs a little bit of funding to do it. So try and look at areas where you can do things very cheaply. Maybe there's a case where you can adjust a bus route and get new coverage and the total distance from the end to end of the bus route is the same. Maybe there's opportunities there. Although generally speaking, bus network reform where you're changing routes does tend to be controversial. So there is a risk with that sort of campaign that you might benefit some people but upset others. So in the Fix800Bus campaign, especially because the route was already direct, we just said, okay, let us upgrade service to 7 days, better weekend service. That was an easy message to sell. Changing a bus route is a harder message to sell. However, one thing that's important is to look at the language that you already have with your high quality of bus services. Like in Brisbane, you've got bus routes that are BUZ or bus upgrade zone. They're buses that run every 15 minutes, 7 days a week until late at night. And they are your really premium bus routes. And that is a language that's used, it's officially recognised, it's used mainly in the city of Brisbane. You have those bus routes. Maybe if you're in an outer area and you think an area justifies a premium type route, maybe use the language and examples of what's already there in your city. Maybe that can help advocate. But you generally only do that for your top tier bus routes that you want to be direct along main roads. So you wouldn't do it for every bus route, but maybe there's a really highly used route in an area without a train service or that needs feeding into a train service. You can advocate that. So definitely look at other examples from your own city, especially if bus routes are less used than ones in your area. There are a lot of cases where some areas have lower needs, but they actually have better service because of historical reasons. So you can help use that in your arguments to justify why you need a better service in your area.
If I've got this correct, you basically get a model that they already have. So something that is very clear, you just can almost copy and paste somewhere else.
Yeah, like you say, I want a timetable like this bus route and it runs through an area with very similar demographics, say on the other side of Brisbane or wherever your city is, or it might even be in your local area. And that may be like it might be on another part of the highway that you want to upgrade your bus service. So just say that, okay, you've done it here. Also look very carefully at recent bus upgrades that they've done and say, you've done it in this area. Why can't we also have it in our area? And here's the reasons why we equally justify the service that they got. But don't begrudge other people the service benefits they got.
If you see another area which has got a good bus service, then you can actually approach them and go, all right, so tell me your figures and your data, what changed, all those sorts of things. How do you get it to work well? So that's really good. What other ideas have you found that worked? And tell us maybe what you found didn't work.
One of the very important things is conversations in the community. So our campaign, which is mostly myself, we had a thing where you've got a QR code on a bit of paper. That QR code had a pre-written letter. People just needed to scan it with their mobile phone and press a couple of buttons, and that would read the QR code. It was preloaded with the email address of whoever you wanted to send it to, and that could mean they could send a letter very quickly. You must avoid form letters when you're trying to write to decision makers. In this case, we had multiple letters, like 30 or 40 different combinations of letters. So if you assume that only 2 or 3% of people who get a letter in their letterbox will actually act on it, then there's a reasonably good chance that you'll get a good diversity of letters and not too much duplication. So a letterbox drops, and the great thing about bus advocacy is that the people that you want to talk to come out on the street and wait under a bus stop sign. They are not all your audience, but part of your audience, so you can talk to them about improved bus service. You can ask them what difference it would make to their life if the bus ran on Sundays or more frequently or later at night. And when you've got those stories, you could, if you wanted to, it depends on people consenting to it, you could make videos and help feed those messages back into your social media campaigns. And talking to people at bus stops is fantastic. Like, there are some people that are very cynical. They might think nothing's going to happen. So that is something to overcome. But there are some people that are really keen, and you might even get people onto your campaign because of that. Social media is very important. It doesn't cost you anything to set up various social media things. That's really important. Videos as well. You can combine your letterboxing with your bus stop conversations with people. You can have the same thing that you put into people's letterboxes. That's also the leaflet that you give to people. So you can combine those roles, and you can look at demographic data. You can look at data that says that these are the highest social needs areas, so you can concentrate on that. You may be able to get data on what are your busiest bus stops, so you can again letterbox the houses around there. You'll generally letterbox houses right on the bus route or within, say, 400 metres of it, depending on the resources that you've got for printing and letterboxing. Overall, you can do around 1,000 houses a day. Letterboxing is really important to get the messages out. You can look at local community notice boards. You can possibly put things up on there. Social media is very important. Often a lot of neighbourhoods might have a social media page, like a local community discussion, and those pages have individual rules, like You may not be able to advertise too much, though in some cases, if it's a community campaign, then they might be tolerant. In other cases, you can indirectly say, okay, someone might be asking a question about buses, and you can then give them an answer. You might not actually mention your campaign specifically, but if people click on that, especially if you have a social media page, then that can help get people more. Then there's petitions. There's a popular website that you can go to have online petitions. Now, that varies in their effectiveness. However, a great thing about those online petitions is that there is a space for people to leave their comments. We really encourage people to do that, because when people leave their comments, you can then again use that. And when you're talking to people and people are saying why we need this bus, like it might be someone who is unable to drive because they're vision impaired, and they talk about how this bus might open up opportunities for them. So these comments, these human interest stories, can really, really help a campaign. It's not just about the facts and figures. The human interest and the difference it makes to people's lives really tells the story, and I think that can help hugely. As for what we could have done more, Greater Dandenong is a very multicultural area. I think we could have engaged more with multicultural groups. We did have different languages on our brochures, but it would be great to have much more engagement with some brochures entirely targeted for particular cultural groups. There could be potential synergies, like say, there might be community centres or that might open on Sundays, and a Sunday bus would benefit them. There's a potential for much more engagement there. We could have done that potentially. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities to get the word out. Some we took, some we didn't.
And did you approach the churches? Very family friendly. Did you engage much with the church communities?
Not very much. I definitely would have dropped a brochure in their letterbox, but I think we should have done a lot more of that potentially, because when you look at where the churches are, the tendency is to go for your big mega churches, and very often they're in areas with zero or very little public transport. And these churches, especially for multicultural groups, have a very wide catchment area. And so, yeah, I think that's an untapped opportunity, particularly for services on the weekends. And a lot of them have activities at other days of the week as well, and maybe in the evening. So, yeah, I think that's a very big opportunity that, depending on the area, a campaign could really tap quite well.
So you mentioned the role of local government. You said that you gave a talk to the LGA. What role do you see that the local government has in terms of trying to get better bus service, other than say, we need more money from the state? Because this is what we find. Our local council, all they say is, we need more money from the state. That's their one line.
True, but it's important to see if local governments have a transport advocacy plan. And if you look on the website, many of them do, and particularly they may have a transport plan and a transport advocacy plan. So there's a role for local residents and community groups to make sure that buses at least feature in the advocacy plan. Now, there are cases of other campaigns, like down on the Mornington Peninsula. That was an outer area, and their local government was very active in advocating for buses about 2 or 3 years ago, and they got their way. It was advocating the state government, but they ran a very good campaign and they got a lot of improvement. So there are things that local governments can do directly, and it makes sense for them to advocate for buses. Like, they were advocating for roads, they might as well advocate for buses as well, and that can really help in terms of local services like libraries, improving the accessibility of those. There may be a temptation for councils to say, okay, well, maybe we'll run a community bus or something if the state won't. However, they tend to be a very limited type service. They may be people with special needs, and for that they make sense. However, they don't scale up to the bigger mass transit needs that people also have. Like, often community buses might not run on weekends, they might not run very direct routes, they might only be 1 or 2 trips to a shopping centre once a week. For people in, especially younger people in casual jobs, other people with social needs, you really do need a 7-day service. It needs to be frequent, preferably direct. So community buses can't really fill that in. You really do need a state involvement. You can't get away from that.
We really need to hear your perspective. You're clearly very strategic in the way that you do that. I think that is a little bit missing in the way that I've seen, well, certainly my perspective, because I'm still learning, but I look at the different groups in the US and they're very strategic. And I have the feeling you have taken a very similar strategy to them.
The US is quite interesting. Like, if you look up, say, the Los Angeles Bus Riders Union, there's a very strong racial equality perspective there. So that may depend on the area that you're campaigning in. Other areas it's more class, lower income type needs. It is very strategic. You can't ask for everything, but if you focus on something very hard, you become a campaign that they can't ignore, and that can really help you get success. You do have to be patient. It might not be immediate, like the 2023 state budget. We're all campaigning vigorously then, and we didn't get what we wanted then. A community campaign can actually do things transport departments can't. Like, transport departments can't really get out there in the community as much as a community campaign. There are cases where you might have a transport department. They are often good people. They're often wanting to advocate things. It can be just as hard for them to get what they want as for people in the community. And there have been cases like with our Route 800 bus campaign where we got improvements, but our whole huge transport department didn't get many improvements. So sometimes the community can actually come through and get great stuff done, even though things might be budgetary quite tight.
That's good to know, because I think a lot of people have this idea, well, the department will solve all my problems.
Now, having said that, regarding the department, it's a very, very important point. They do need to be on side. They cannot obviously publicly be on side in the campaign, but what will often happen is that once your campaigner has a profile and it's too big or too prominent to ignore, then those in charge will ask the department for this view on this, and they will analyse things, they'll compare it with other things. Of course, it will be often transport departments that need to implement what you are proposing. Therefore, what you are proposing has to be practical. It has to stack up in the real world. So you really do need your department to be on board in that regard, because they can't necessarily be involved in the campaign beforehand.
I remember when I first started a Get Around, and I just started because I got on the bus. I spent 40 minutes meandering, 10 minutes wait at the train station, and then, it went everywhere. I think what I was quite surprised at was I just started a community group because I wanted to help something. And then I started meeting people and they're like, well, you have to fix the bus line and you have to fix this. And all of a sudden, I'm responsible for all buses in the whole of Queensland or the whole of Australia. That really shocked me, that I was now an authority figure on all things, and I somehow had a magic wand.
We had the Fix 800 thing, but you'll have people say, what about the Route 802, 804 or whatever? And you do have to be diplomatic there. You do say, yes, the 800 is the focus, but when we win this one, because we think this is the biggest chance to win, then you can move on to the other campaigns. That's something that I would like to do. Since we've had this win, we can move on to some of the other needs.
What is something that our listener can do? Now, our listener, I'm going to give you 3 listeners, because I think what you have provided is very rich and informative. So one is a community member, maybe my friend. She's fantastic. She listens to all my episodes. She's like my number 1 fan. And she's a mum with a couple of kids, husband, and she's taking care of the little people. What's something that she could do without joining a group? She doesn't really have time. She's not politically motivated, but nonetheless, she's been hugely informed by these podcasts that I have. What would be something for her?
First of all, talk to people who would benefit from a bus service upgrade. Tell them they're not alone. Give them something to do.
Okay, so reach out to other people in the community. Tell the local politicians they want something better.
Yes, and you sort of have to build it up. That's something to do. May have to be a Facebook page. One of the important things, yes, social media is important. However, it mustn't be the only thing. It has to be a message to those who are in charge of the decisions, and you have to provide an easy way for people to have their voice heard. So think of yourself as an enabler to help other people have their voice heard on what needs to be done for buses, and preferably have a united and focused message, which you can do by talking to people at particular bus stops, identifying a particular need, working out one specific thing that can be done and would make a big difference to a lot of people's lives.
So that's my friend. We've got advocacy groups, people like me or different organizations. They have a broad view. Okay, so our listener is somebody in that space. What would you suggest?
Okay, look up other advocacy groups. Like in Brisbane, there's Rail Back on Track that you might be familiar with. Despite their name, they also do bus advocacy. There might be environmental groups that may have an interest. There might be youth groups, maybe church groups, local area groups. Try and find like-minded people. For that social media is a great tool to find those connections, but you need to go beyond social media. You need a personal touch. You need some form of campaign and try and identify people. And especially with, again, although we can't talk about politics here, politics is absolutely unavoidable. I'm talking about small p politics. That is, big P politics is a bit of a dirty term, but you actually have to organize people, talk to people. That, in my view, is part of social organizing politics, getting people in board, winning support, getting change. And it does have to be through political mechanisms. And with an election coming up, now is a fantastic time.
So for our listener who is in, say, local government, what would you suggest?
Local government, look at advocacy, look at your own council's advocacy plan, look at the advocacy plan for surrounding councils. Maybe there's a potential to get a joint movement that is too big to be ignored amongst several local government areas, because bus routes often, pass through different local government areas, and there can be cases where an improvement to one route may benefit 2 or 3 adjoining areas. So consider that. Look at your council's transport plan, see if your council is on regional transport discussion forums. If not, maybe your council should try and take the lead on establishing them, because councils often do have transport planners in them. It's not just state government, and they have different backgrounds. Some of them may have a public transport background, some might be road engineers, so you may need to educate them or get their support on that. But so there's both the bureaucracy within the local government and also individual councillors. Identify those who have been vocal on transport, that they might be good people to support you as well.
Thank you very much. I found this such a rich conversation. You've been really informative and successful. That's wonderful news, and I'm extremely jealous. Anything else you would like to add before we wrap up?
If people want more information on our campaign, they can look on Facebook, Fix800Bus, or they can search on the internet, Fix800Bus. You can see it hashtagged on various other social media as well. And I also write the blog Melbourne on Transit. I'm also on LinkedIn, so they can drop me a line there if they need to contact me.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time out, and I know you've got plenty of things to do. I've loved the conversation. Thank you, and thank you so much on behalf of the community for all the amazing work. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. A pleasure.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.